Ah, so in my check-in, I was talking about just acknowledging everything that's going on in the world right now. Um, and a lot of my reaction, it's brought up in me this sense of anger. Anger at our country, anger at a lot of people, anger at the fact that we just have all these attacks on children, people of color, women on the planet. And it's rare that I experience this type of anger, but I also know what it feels like to have anger that is all encompassing. And so I've practiced with it a lot. And so this anger that I have now, it's almost like it's a part of my experience rather than owning my experience. It's like my anger is a character in this play of my life rather than the director. And I feel very grateful to my practice that that's the role that my anger plays for me. As I said, like I have definitely experienced the all-consuming type of anger, and that happened a lot in this 11-year relationship that I had that was pretty tumultuous. Somehow our closest relationships tend to push our buttons the most. And so I remember that feeling all-consuming. I remember that feeling out of control. I definitely remember feeling like I was not at my best self and that I was suffering a lot. There was so much suffering. Lama Rod Owens, in his book, Love and Rage, says that beneath the anger is hurt and despair, and taking care of that woundedness is the path out of suffering. And this path, right, this Buddhist path is all about suffering and the way out of suffering. So oftentimes anger, especially in this world as it is today, especially when it comes to thinking about activism, often really giving into that anger may make us feel powerful and like we're actually doing something. But at the end of the day, engaging in the takeover of anger actually just perpetuates the cycle of violence, both within ourselves and outside of ourselves. And so again, like I'm so grateful to my practice for allowing anger to be there and using the energy of my anger to direct it towards actually taking action, wise action. So there might be a question of like, okay, well, how do I do this, right? Like anger tends to be just this like burning compulsion. And the first thing I think to realize and to acknowledge is that anger isn't bad, right? I'm not saying here, push away your anger, get rid of it. Anger actually brings intelligence, right? It tells us something is wrong. There's intelligence in anger. And often it's the normal, natural, healthy reaction to shit that's going on, like right now. And so what do we do with it? What do we do with it so that it becomes a character in our play rather than the director? Have you guys heard of the acronym RAIN? Yeah. So I find that RAIN practice, I'll go through it. RAIN practice is really helpful when I notice anger. So RAIN stands for recognize, acknowledge, investigate, and nurture. So recognize is like, oh, there's something going on. I need to pay attention to it. Acknowledge or accept is like, okay, I'm not going to try to push it away. I'm not going to try to get rid of it. I'm not going to judge myself for it. I'm just going to accept that it's here. And that's a huge step, right? Accepting, acknowledging. It's almost like you're opening yourself to it. Investigate here, when it comes to anger, for me, means seeing that wound that Lama Rod was talking about, seeing the woundedness and the hurt and the despair that's underneath the anger. And the nurture is giving ourselves what we need, self-compassion, speaking to ourselves kindly. And so if we can let this wound, the hurt, emerge, as Lama Rod said, this can be a way out of suffering. Rumi, the Sufi poet, also said, The wound is the place where the light enters you. And I definitely know for myself, when I've actually touched into that woundedness underneath the anger, it just opens up my field of view so much more, right? Like this anger feels like it's tunnel vision, I need to direct this at I need to blame someone, I need to direct it at someone. Whereas when I touch into this woundedness, I'm like, oh, I see the bigger picture. I see the bigger picture in me. And I see how this is hurting other people as well. And so this practice, this Buddhist practice that we're engaging in, has taught me that suffering is everywhere, right? First noble truth, there is suffering in this world, in this life. And everything is the result of causes and conditions, which is karma. So that means everything that happens doesn't just happen for one reason or because of one person. It happens because of a lot of causes and conditions that affected that person, the environment that they were in, the environment that the action took place in, like so many things that we can't even comprehend fed into every single action. That's what karma is. And so with that understanding as my foundation, the way I get to having anger be a character rather than a director is through practice. And specifically for me, it's been this practice of compassion. And so, some people might mistake compassion for like thoughts and prayers, right? Which a lot of people are giving right now, which seems really mind-numbing. Thoughts and prayers are not enough right now. We need action. This compassion practice that I'm talking about, for me, has motivated me to action. This compassion practice is not about just empathizing. It's about feeling with those who are hurt, including myself, and then inclining my mind towards wise action. There's always that action part with it. Practicing in this way just makes sure that the action isn't reactive and isn't like by the seat of my pants and doesn't perpetuate the harm. It comes from a place of caring first and foremost about myself and caring about the overall environment that I'm in and not wanting to perpetuate the same cycles of violence. And so if the basis of my action is a mind of compassion for myself, for my community, for the communities that have been injured, for even the contributors to harm, then I can try to make sure that I'm not using the same tools that got us in this mess to begin with. I want to read this passage from Lama Rod's book, Love and Rage, again, where he really drives home the point that coming out of compassion is not just for the world outside of us and for the people around us and those injured. It's also for ourselves, for our own freedom. So this is what he says. He says, we have to understand that at some point we have to develop an attitude of needing to love everything, especially what is unlovable. Everything has to be loved if you're interested in getting free. I'm talking about freedom from duality. I'm talking about freedom from binary thinking. I'm talking about freedom from always being triggered. I'm talking about freedom from the ways in which I'm deeply attached to ego. Freedom from always performing for other people. Freedom from always living outside of my body. That kind of freedom, coming back into wholeness, coming back into privileging what I need. And so privileging what I need isn't saying that I'm more important than other people. It's saying I need to start with a position of love, and I can't share that love with other people unless I have it for myself and I'm taking care of myself. So I don't know if you guys know, have you heard of Deep Dish Conversations? It's a podcast and YouTube channel based in Nashville. Okay, it's not that like widespread. So this amazing guy named Jerome Moore does these conversations with people in the community in Nashville. Just anyone who's like doing stuff in the community in Nashville, and they're 1 hour long recordings so that he can actually like have a deeper conversation with these people. So I did an interview with him. I was talking about this Sangha, And we touched on the topic of compassion, and I was talking about having compassion for all people. I mean, all people, like even perpetrators of harm, like even Trump, right? Even the shooters. And he asked, what if people can't? Like, what if they can't get there? Like, you're going to ask me as a person of color to have compassion for somebody who's harming people of color? That might be a step too far. And yes, that is absolutely valid. And I say honor that, right? Like, this is not something that you have to push. It's something that you can practice, because again, it comes back to our own freedom and not letting anger rule us. And so we can honor the limits of our compassion. And the step that we can take, kind of baby step, is to say, well, let me just start by acknowledging suffering. Remember, karma, causes and conditions. Everything came from a point of suffering that is creating harm. And so if we can acknowledge the suffering, we don't have to maybe go as far as saying, I care about your pain. We can just acknowledge for myself, there was pain involved. And that can be a first step. And so this raises some great questions, right? Which I think they're good questions to chew on, and we can talk about them after this. Is, does everyone deserve compassion? Are all people fundamentally good? The Buddha taught that yes, all people have basic goodness, are fundamentally good. We just all have this dust in our eyes and just layering upon layering of distractions and being ingrained by systems, both in this life and possibly even previous lives. But this is a good question for us to chew on for ourselves, right? Do we fundamentally believe this? Do I fundamentally believe that all people are fundamentally good? Another good question to play with could be, if you did really believe this, what would life look like and feel like for you? Food for thought. And so that comes back to the final question of, is there an edge to your compassion? Do you want there to be an edge to your compassion? I've been trying to understand where it all comes from, this like impulse to dominate, to compete, to extract from the earth, to extract from other people, to commit violence when we feel uncomfortable. And a part of me is wondering, is this just like human nature? It comes back to the question of, are we fundamentally good or not, right? And I was saying earlier that I've been listening and reading and learning about Indigenous ways of being. And the Indigenous worldview is that the way of dominance is not natural to us, right? Indigenous people lived on this earth for thousands and thousands and thousands of years without having to dominate the earth, without having to dominate all of each other. They lived in this regenerative way, which acknowledged the cycle of life, the circle of life, the interconnectedness of life, and the fact that we are a part of this planet, just like we are a part of each other. There's an author named Darshan Narvez who writes about the evolved nest. And she talks about how a lot of the European kind of dominant ways of child rearing are about separation. So separation between infant and mother, and separation from just being, right? Like, I feel like we've been trained to not be with our being, and that includes not being with nature and not connecting to each other. It's like immediately, it's like, let's try to get these people productive as fast as possible and self-sufficient. And so maybe that causes trauma, that maybe that caused our original trauma. And so when I think about people who have committed these atrocities, I think of Would I have behaved differently if I had been in the same circumstances as them? Again, causes and conditions, karma. It's a law of nature, karma. So I offer these just as more like food for thought rather than really as a teaching today. Questions to chew on, questions to talk about with each other. And then I want to share, I want to end with this poem by Dr. Larry Ward from America's Racial Karma. And I love this because he talks about some real heavy shit. And then he ends with compassion. So this poem is called When I Became Currency. When they came for me, I tried to contain my fear and my heartbreak. My bones longed for home as I, sick in the bottom of a ship, became a dark currency carried over the sea. I was sold and sold again, a commodity, an instrument of profit, seduced and sustained by greed, arrogance, and ignorance. Cold and beleaguered in a new land unknown, I tried to forget such horror in my bones, but the looks and whispers even to this day remind me. I am a class of color created by a colonial mind missing its own self-worth. But the dance of my ancestors in my bones have kept me awake and kept me alive. I live beyond such limiting constructs of mind. I am free because I'm not confused. I am stardust awake. I am the earth and sky embracing all. I ride the wind with the eagle and the hawk. I flow with the rivers into all oceans. I touch the sun and am touched by the moonlight like all beings. I am nature herself, awake, powerful, resilient, generative. I offer the love of all my ancestors to your ancestors and the ancestors of all beings. I offer my presence like rain falling on the wise and the unwise, the troubled and the untroubled, the just and the unjust, so that the wounds of time may be healed in the dance of the flow of birth and death. Thank you. I'd like to open it up for any thoughts.